Since the XY plane consists of two number lines, or axes, it makes sense to start coding out one number line, and then when we're ready to add a second one, we can do that. So let's go into our source folder, and we're going to make a new file. We'll call this axis.vue. And this is where our axis component will go. So if you recall from the last video, we need three things: a template tag. That's where our HTML will go. We need a script tag, where our component JavaScript will go. And then we need a style tag. Now, one thing that Vue will enforce inside of our template is that we need to have a single parent container. We're not allowed, for example, to have two siblings like this. Vue will complain about that and our code's not going to work. So I typically like to have a single div and give it a class of whatever my component name is, -container. And inside here for now, we're just going to have something simple like I am an axis. Inside of our script tag is where we're going to export our component object. And typically for Vue components, we're going to have data, which does need to be a function itself that returns an object. And we might have some things in here like message or something similar. And then in our template, we can say my message is message. And maybe we want the message itself to be I am an axis. In that case, we would do this. And the goal here would be for our message to display in the browser. Now that's not going to work now because in our main app component, we need to actually pull in our axis component. So to do that, we're going to use a custom HTML tag using the name of our component. And down where our main app component is, we need to import our axis component. And our axis component is in the same folder as our app component. So we can use the dot and / to represent that. And we want to bring in axis.vue. We also need to tell our component that it's going to be using our axis component. So any such components can be put here. We're going to go ahead and get rid of this message now since we're demonstrating how that works inside of our axis component. And this should be enough to pull in our axis component that we've set up. So we're going to run this and see what happens. We need to again run npm run dev. And there's our component. Now, of course, this doesn't look like a number line at all, so we're going to work on that next. Let's go back to our editor and back to our axis component. And we might not need a message for an axis or a number line, but we might possibly need a label. So let's go ahead and add that. And for now, we're going to add the default value just to be X. So we're going to think of this as the X axis. We're also going to remove the part that says my message is, and we're just going to let it display the message itself. So let's go ahead and add a main style for the axis container. And let's set a background equal to black and a height of 1 pixel. That seems about right for a number line. And we want this to be located basically in the middle of our screen going horizontally. So we're going to give it a position absolute, and we'll say top 0, bottom 0, left 0, and right 0. And then if we say margin auto, that ought to make our number line in the middle of our screen. So let's try that out and see what it's looking like. And there we go. There's our number line. Now notice we don't see our message anywhere. So to try to fix this, let's wrap our message in a label. And we need to change our template to say display the label and not the message variable. So that's just making sure that our tag here matches up with our data property name. And now if we go back to our browser, we should see that in fact we do have a label here for our number line. Now we're going to assume that 0 is in the middle of our number line here, and we don't have anything remotely representing this idea in our code, but just conceptually we're going to think of the middle of the number line here from browser left edge to browser right edge to be 0. And the next thing that we want to do is put a point right there at the number 0 and make sure that it shows up where we think it should. If you're thinking that the next thing I'm going to do is create a new component and call it a point component, then you're definitely catching on to the component-based approach when working with Vue. We're going to do exactly just that and come into our source folder, say new file. I'm going to call this point.vue. And again, we're going to have our 3 different types of tags here: template, script, and style. And our template needs to have its main div container here. And like our normal, we're going to give this a class of point-container. And in our JavaScript area, we're going to again export default object. And the name here is going to be point. And we're not going to care too much about where this thing lands in the browser right now. We're just going to say that our point container should be, and we can pick a width and height here for our point. This is something that should be adjustable later, but for now we're just going to say width 5 pixels, height 5 pixels, background, let's say background color, and we'll have that again be black, and maybe the color again is something else that we could have adjustable later on. And the last thing we're going to do is say border radius 50%. And this will give the effect of a filled in circle that is 5 pixels in diameter. Now we do have a few choices as far as how we import our point component into our app. And if we think about it, it doesn't exactly make sense for a point to belong to an axis. We can think of the point as belonging to the plane, since the point is not necessarily part of the axis. So for that reason, I'm going to go back up to my top level app, and for now I'm just going to insert my point here. And of course that means I need to import point from current folder point.vue, and then I need to add point here as one of the components I'm depending on. Now that should place our point somewhere in the browser, so let's see what's going on there. And there we go. We now have a point. Before we do anything else, let's go ahead and clean up our styles a little bit. So we'll go back into our code editor, and let's first go into our axis component, and let's make it so that our label is showing on the right side of the screen instead of the left. And this is because typically we think of, if this is 0, we typically think of this as the positive direction and this as the negative direction. So we just want to put our label in the positive direction over here. Let's go ahead and save this, and then we'll make sure we need to tell it right 0. And there's our label. And the next thing we said we wanted to do was to get this point to sit right here where we think 0 should be. So how are we going to do that? Well, let's first go into our point component. This is where we're eventually going to put our code. But for now, let's just play around in the browser console and see what kind of style rules we might apply to get the point in the center here. So if we look at our HTML, we see it looks just about exactly like we would expect, with our app container here, our axis component container, and our point container. So let's do the same thing with the point that we did with the number line to start with. So we'll say position absolute, right 0, left 0, top 0, bottom 0. And then once we say margin auto, there we go. We have our point in the center. Now this might work if that's all we wanted to do, but in our next steps, we want to actually make the point move in the positive direction or in the negative direction by a specific amount, which might even be controlled by a user input or a formula. So let's try to do a little bit better than just setting everything equal to 0 right here. Now, since we have a one-dimensional number line, it does make sense for now to keep the top and the bottom equal to 0 so that it will just stay right on the axis all the time. But what we want to vary right now is the left and the right properties. In fact, let's just get rid of the left one altogether, and notice that our point goes all the way to the right. And that's what we expect with the CSS property right and setting that equal to 0. Of course, we don't have a parent container for our point with position relative, and so that means the point just goes to the far right of our browser window. And we will want to improve on this a little bit, but for now, let's just go with using the right property to specify where the point should be. If we want the point in the middle of the number line, then maybe we can say right equals 50%. And great, that looks like exactly what we wanted. But if we wanted to move the point now, considering this 0, if we wanted it to move in the direction of 1, 2, 3, and so on, we're going to need a CSS calculation. And so if we want to think of, let's say for now, 10 pixels as being 1 unit, then we might say something like 50% plus 10 pixels. And let's see, did that do anything? If we change 10 back to 0, yeah, it did. It's moving it back and forth just a little bit. Notice though that it's actually moving. I'm going to put 100 in here now, and we'll see it's moving the wrong way. We want to say intuitively that plus 100 would be in the positive direction, but because of the way that the right property works in CSS, we actually need to make this minus 100 pixels. So a value of 0 for x would put us here, and that would correspond to 0 pixels in our CSS property. And then again, if 10 pixels were 1 x unit, then when x equals 1, we would have 10, or more specifically minus 10. And if we wanted x to have a value of 10, well then we would put minus 100 pixels in our calculation, and there we go. So this is working pretty well, I think. Let's go ahead and add these rules into our point component here. And if we save that and go back to the browser, let's go ahead and reload here just to be sure. And we're looking pretty good. So we'll go ahead and stop there for this video, and in the next video we'll look at how we can move our point back and forth along the number line according to a value that comes from a user generated input.